Hello, I'm Josh Tewksbury, and I am the moderator of the full scientific session, Tipping Points in Natural and Social Systems, Engaging Irreversible Change. And thank you for joining us. This is one of 3 pre-recorded presentations focusing on Diana Liverman's material, recorded before all the panelists come together in February live for this discussion. In this video, Diana will be discussing how we can tip towards a safe and just space for people and the planet. Midway through the video, I will again join Diana to further delve into the material as the discussant.
Good day, I'm Diana Liverman from the University of Arizona, and today I'm going to talk about some of the work I've been doing with the Earth Commission, where we're trying to identify a safe space, a stable Earth system, as well as a just space fair to all human beings for people and the planet. And I'm going to be reflecting on some of the social science work we've been doing. So the Earth Commission works with Future Earth and a number of other groups in the Global Commons Alliance. There are 19 commissioners supported by a wonderful team of researchers. And we've been divided into working groups, and I work with Joyita Gupta on Working Group 4, which focuses on governance and transformation and a lot of the consideration of what is just. Some of the questions the Commission's looking at, the main question is, what are the environmental thresholds that we should not cross in order to safeguard a planet that can support human well-being for everyone? And then in Working Group 4, we're trying to understand what should be the social goals, the societal transformations, the social tipping points, positive and negative, and the governance approaches that will take us on pathways within a corridor to a safe and just future. So we're inspired partly by the work on planetary boundaries and of other Earth scientists who have tried to identify targets for changes that could take us into very dangerous places like climate change, loss of biodiversity, intense levels of pollution. And that is how we're thinking about safe, and we're combining that with ideas of justice, particularly those that are embodied in the UN Sustainable Development Goals about access for all people to food, to energy, to health, about eradicating poverty, and doing that without creating environmental problems. So firstly, how are we thinking about justice? Well, we're using some of the key insights from the social sciences that divide justice into various components. First of all, distributive justice, which is who gets the goods and bads in society. What is the different allocations of responsibility and of harm in space and time? So when we're thinking about the Earth system, this includes responsibility for the Earth system change. What is the equity component of responsibility for destroying biodiversity, for greenhouse gas emissions? Who is causing it, who is not? Then there's the question of equity in who is being affected by the Earth system, where we know that often the disadvantaged and the vulnerable are much more affected than better off countries and people. And then finally, a sort of emerging question is responding to global change. How do we think about justice in terms of who's responsible for reducing emissions? Who should be paying for the response to Earth system change? And how do we make sure those responses don't create further inequities? Another idea of justice is procedural justice. This is who's involved in decision-making, who's part of the process, who's represented, and who participates. Other ideas of justice include recognitional justice, restorative justice, and of course, the really important one for the Earth system, intergenerational justice. What is justice when we're changing the Earth system in ways that could have severe implications for future generations? And we're also struggling with how you measure justice. Are there indicators that could, for example, be put into Earth system models? So as an example, how do we address justice when we're setting climate targets? Well, first of all, there's the procedural justice about who is involved in setting those targets. And at the moment, the main venue is the UNFCCC, which is intergovernmental. So it's mostly only representatives of nation states who are part of that decision-making. There are circles of people who can attend the climate negotiations and give very brief talks about their goals. That includes women's groups, indigenous groups, other non-nation state actors, and citizens, but they are not the ones per se who are setting the targets. In terms of justice in allocation, the distributional justice issue, then there are a lot of very complicated issues. First of all is the debate about how to allocate responsibility for emission reductions. And how do we calculate that responsibility? Well, at the country level, we have to decide whether we should be looking at current emissions or accumulated historical emissions, per capita emissions, or emissions that are consumed. Or should we even be looking at the national level? Should we in fact be distributing responsibility for emission reductions in proportion to the emissions of cities or of major corporations? Other distributional questions around the response to climate change is true justice would be that nobody loses life or livelihood from the impacts of climate change or the responses to it. People can be damaged by mitigation and in adaptation. But for the Earth Commission, we would hope to be able to reduce climate risk, find ways to reduce climate risks while improving well-being, not just making sure nobody is harmed, and even better, the goal of a safe planet and justice and well-being for everyone. Just to illustrate the questions about allocation of responsibility for carbon dioxide emissions, you can see this compares emissions from the US, the EU, China, and India. The left-hand column looks at current emissions. And if we looked at responsibility based only on today and at the national level, then China is the largest emitter, followed by the US. But if we look at historical emissions, and greenhouse gases stay in the atmosphere for a number of years, so many do argue for historical responsibility, then the US has much larger responsibility than China because its economy has been developed for so much longer. Per capita emissions shows another pattern, very high per capita emissions in the US, less in the EU and in China, and tiny per capita emissions in India, which India uses to argue that they should be less responsible for action. And then we've got the difference between production and consumption emissions. This one shows that if you look at where China's emissions are consumed, they bear less responsibility because of all of the emissions embodied in their exports. In terms of corporate emissions, this is an interesting graphic where the logos are in proportion to the emissions of major corporations, including national corporations. And some feel as though it would be more equitable to allocate emission reductions to companies rather than to countries. Another issue we're looking at are the trade-offs and synergies between safe and just. How do the efforts to reduce biophysical risks, to stay within planetary boundaries, interact with the social goals and with justice? And here there are some really challenging questions. If we set aside land protected for biodiversity and we take that land out of agriculture and human use, what will that mean for food security and for other land that humans are using? If we allocate water to nature, to ecosystems, what will that mean in terms of water allocations to humans, many of whom have very poor access to safe water? If we want to reduce and limit phosphorus and nitrogen pollution and set a target for that, that can affect parts of the world which are limited in terms of soil fertility, and where the only way to ensure food security locally is to use some level of fertilizer. And then finally, there's the question of the climate target, where land use and the growing of more forests may be required to limit climate change, as well as the need to set aside land for bioenergy to reduce fossil fuel energy use, particularly in transport, and the land that might take up from human use, particularly from food production. So here's the example from the 1.5 report, where most of the scenarios that would keep warming under 1.5 degrees C involve some level of negative emissions, where we would use forestry to sequester carbon emissions, bioenergy to reduce fossil fuel use, and CCS. And almost all of the scenarios require these sorts of shifts towards negative emissions. And this is just one graphic that models the implications, two scenarios for trying to limit temperature. And in both of them, forest and energy crop area, the turquoise and the orange, expands at the expense of food crops, which are in pink, or pasture, which is in light green. So if you're shifting all of this land to sequestration and bioenergy, what does that mean for food security and livelihoods around the world? And what could we do in terms of, for example, increasing agricultural yields to make sure people are still fed even if there is less cropland? Finally, talk a little bit about transformations and tipping points, which Tim and Joanne are going to talk about in more detail. For Working Group 4, transformation is fundamental. It's much more than the incremental shifts within the current system that you might think of as gentle transitions. When we think about transformation, we're thinking about significant and radical changes in structures, political and economic structures, in systems, technical systems, in meanings and values. What Lysenko and O'Brien have talked about as personal transformations in deep values, practical transformations in technology, and political transformations in the way we allocate resources or represent the different groups in society. And just to give you a few examples of my own thinking about societal transformations that are both safe and just, or link safety and justice. The first is the improvement in women's rights and the status of women around the world. Still not enough, but that improved gender equality has meant women are now able to choose the number of children they want to have. That has led to a dramatic decline in fertility, halving in many parts of the world. That slowed population growth and presumably has reduced the environmental impact of population. Second example is looking at capitalism, and groups within social science have pointed out or have hypothesized that when capitalism starts to be affected by the environmental crisis, when its workers become unhealthy, when the water and other resources become degraded, that then you will start to see fundamental change. The government may intervene to maintain the situation through regulation. There may be self-awareness that means that corporations will turn to more sustainable, they'll identify environmental targets in order for self-survival. And that too can lead to a reduction in environmental impact. And then finally, we can look at transformations in scientific knowledge and the way in which the work of scientists in the IPCC or working on ozone led to international environmental agreements and governance. The ozone protocol is a success. The Antarctic Treaty, setting aside a whole continent for science and biodiversity, and hopefully the Paris Agreement that will result in reduced greenhouse gas emissions. With that, I'll end and look forward to the questions. Thank you.
So that was a great talk, Diana. I really appreciated all of the points you raised, and I wanted to start with a question really around the question is around how science has impact and how you see your engagement with the Earth Commission or with other structures you've been involved with, IPCC in other words and otherwise. Like, how does it create impact in the world? And how do you actually merge this sort of social sciences with the natural sciences to get at these pressures between making targets that stick, and and doing the work on justice that we need to see, that is probably harder to do within single targets?
Okay, those are really profound and broad questions. So let me just have a go at a couple of angles. So in terms of how science has impact, and the Earth Commission really is trying to respond to stakeholders in ways that are constructive. I mean, first of all, there's a big emerging literature on sort of science communication and science engagement. And we need to pay attention to that. We can't just do our science and sort of throw it over the wall and hope people will use it. We have to engage with our stakeholders. We have to listen to them. And then we often have to rethink our science to give them what they want rather than what we think they want. And, in terms of examples of Earth system science having an impact, the best example is probably IPCC. And I was a lead author for the 1.5 report, and that actually had much greater impact than any of us thought it would, whether it be in the media, whether it be corporate, cities. Everybody sort of paid attention and tried to think about how they could make these really draconian cuts in emissions that we were proposing. The second question about sort of working in interdisciplinary context of natural and social sciences. That's one of the exciting things about the Earth Commission, but it's also very challenging. It's almost like working with the stakeholders. You really have to listen to each other and try to understand each person's perspective. So there's a couple of areas which we're finding very challenging. One is trying to come up with quantitative targets for social justice. And we're looking at the Sustainable Development Goals, but actually if you dig into the Sustainable Development Goals, most of those have not developed targets, or they're targets that are actually quite disputed within the social sciences. So how do you measure poverty, for example? What indicator would you use for hunger? And so in working in particular with the integrated modelers in the Earth Commission, trying to come up with a few simple indicators of justice, of equality, or even of measures like poverty and hunger is pretty challenging. And I would say the second part is, social scientists have many different worldviews, probably much greater range of perspectives than in the natural sciences. So even getting the social scientists to agree on something can be quite challenging, but is also intellectually a lot of fun.
Oh, yeah, that's great. That seems like a huge challenge. And I was struck at the end of your talk by sort of your exploration of a number of ways in which societies can shift, either through tipping points or the transformations we need. And I just wondered if you could say a little bit more about that sort of center point and the potential role that that the private sector has to play, and how you motivate that role, from the science communities.
Yeah, so I've thought a lot about what motivates businesses to change their perspective, and in fact worked with quite a few groups who are collaborating with business, including Global Commons Alliance and the Earth Commission. And, we can have this very sort of first level analysis of corporate social responsibility, but actually within social science, particularly within sort of political economy and Marxism, there's a very interesting explanation which argues that capitalism does what it needs to survive. And once capitalism or business sees that it's undermining its own survival, either because its workers are getting sick or because the environment is degrading around it and it can't get water, it can't get clean energy, then it is going to change out of self-interest. So whilst it's really important for activist groups to put pressure, because business might be behind the curve in understanding the severity of the crisis, it is like there's a lot of self-interest in their response. The other thing is theories of the role of the state, which is why government steps in. And there's really interesting analyses of how the state, the government, will step in order sort of to stabilize capitalism. That there's this partnership between government and capitalism where government can step in to regulate capitalism, but it's actually to ensure that capitalism continues. So I've always found those arguments very interesting. And actually, a very good explanation of why business and the corporate sector will act.
Oh, that's great. Well, I really appreciate it. Thanks so much. We'll go to the rest of the panel.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you again, Diana, for your remarks. Just a reminder that this is but one of 3 spotlight videos focusing on the individual work of the speakers before they all come together in February in the live panel, Tipping Points in Natural and Social Systems, Engaging Irreversible Change. Please check the AAAS annual meeting website for the panel's date and time. Again, thank you, Diana, and thank you, audience, for being here. We will see you live in February.